We're here. We can make a start now.
Okay. Hello, good evening, and welcome to the next of our English Catholic History Association talks. As you know, we have talks every month, or aim to have them every month, and we have very many distinguished scholars, writers, researchers, and academics of various sorts to talk about their research and their knowledge and share it with us. So very welcome to everybody, and I hope you all enjoy the talk this evening. Our speaker this evening that we've got here for our talk is Jade Scott, Dr. Jade Scott, and she's written a wonderful book which is The Life and Letters of Lady Anne Percy, Countess of Northumberland, 1536 to 1591. She's going to talk to us this evening a little bit about that and about the Northern Rebellion, which was during the reign of Elizabeth I. So, for those who are not sure, the Northern Rebellion was 1569. It was an unsuccessful attempt by Catholic nobles to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots. The rebellion was also known as the Rising of the North, or Rising of the Revolt of the Northern Earls. And it was to do with Catholicism, power, and Elizabeth's lifestyle and her inability to marry, or a wish not to marry, and therefore have an heir. And involved starting at Durham, captured Hartlepool, besieged Barnard Castle, and captured a lot of Northumberland, but led to the unfortunate execution of a lot of the members of that revolt. So I'll tell you a little bit about Dr. Scott. She's an affiliate in Scottish history at the University of Glasgow and secretary of the Scottish History Society. She's an expert in early modern women's letters and letter writing cultures and has published widely on various aspects of correspondence, including rhetorical, linguistic, and material strategies of women writers. Her Arts and Humanities Research Council UK funded PhD analysed the letters of Lady Anne Percy, Countess of Northumberland, and an edition of these letters was published in April last year by Boydell and Brewer for the Catholic Record Society record series. And they are the people who sent me a copy of it. So very welcome, Dr. Scott. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited actually to have the chance to talk a bit more about Lady Anne Percy, the Countess of Northumberland. This is a woman who is incredibly kind of influential in the 16th century, but who has for a very long time been somewhat overlooked. I think perhaps because attention has inevitably in the past focused on the men who were involved in the rebellion that we're going to look at this evening, and also kind of the kind of Catholic networks within England and beyond. Again, there's been a kind of more focus on the men involved with that in terms of the networks we're going to look at. So I'm really quite excited to have the chance to talk about Lady Anne and really kind of share my enthusiasm for this remarkable woman and try and illuminate some of the different ways that she enacted kind of religious and socio-political agency. So that is my aim this evening. It might be that we have to do a bit of a whistle-stop tour because there's a lot to kind of try and cover, and I'll inevitably forget to mention something. But hopefully, if you have any questions, you can let me know if there's something you think I've missed or you'd like to find out more about. Percy then. Lady Anne Percy was born around about 1536. We don't know her exact date of birth, but we know that she was baptised in 1536. She lived until 1591. She died, sadly, she died reportedly by a rather unfavourable newsletter back to England describing her as furiously mad. But we know that she died in Namur, after spending almost 20 years as an exile on the continent after the Northern Rebellion of 1569. She was the daughter of Henry Somerset, the second Earl of Worcester, and his second wife, Elizabeth Brown. We don't know, sadly, a great deal about her early life, but we know that her childhood was mostly spent at her father's Monmouthshire estates, principally at Chepstow Castle. She was kind of raised there with several other siblings, both female and male, her brothers and sisters. But we don't know a great deal really about her early years. It's not until 1554 that she starts to kind of really start to crop up in the archival sources, when she is granted, she's awarded a grant by Mary I and her husband Philip, alongside various other young women who have clearly just arrived at the royal court. And then in 1557, we know that she is a member of Mary's household. She's named as a maid of honour in the Queen's household in the New Year's gift roll from that year. So we know that she, like various contemporary noble young women, was sent to the court to try and secure some kind of position for herself. In 1558, on the 12th of June, she marries Thomas Percy, the 7th Earl of Northumberland. Northumberland had only recently been restored to his estates and titles, which had been forfeited after his own father had taken part in the Pilgrimage of Grace and been executed for his involvement there. So he'd only recently been restored. So when she marries Thomas Percy, they are both new to their kind of estate, to the estate and to the title and the responsibilities that came with being one of the most prominent northern nobles in England. Like many couples in the 16th century, they sadly suffered the loss of several children. They had a son who was born in 1560, but he died in infancy. But they did have four daughters who survived into adulthood: Elizabeth, Lucy, Jane, and Mary. And it was Mary who might be recognisable to some of you. Mary Percy founded or was the abbess of the convent of the Assumption of Our Blessed Lady in Brussels. And we'll see the kind of connection with the continent as we look at Lady Anne Percy's life this evening. Came the Earl and Countess of Northumberland, and Anne always signed herself in her letters as A. Northumberland. She always referred to herself as, Lady Northumberland or Anne Northumberland. And so that was one of the ways that I was able to, in my edition of Anne's letters, think about how she authorises letters, how she might kind of construct her letters. Her signature is really key. She has quite a distinctive signature, and she always signs herself as A. Northumberland. However, somewhat unexpectedly, I suppose, the couple did not actually spend their time at the ancient Percy seat of Alnwick Castle. Alnwick had been stripped during Northumberland's disinheritance. It was not particularly fit for them to live in. They were also in a dispute with various people who had tried to occupy the castle in the past, and it meant that the couple actually spent most of their time at their Yorkshire estates in Topcliffe. And it's there that we find Lady Anne kind of acting as kind of estate manager and managing the household, doing many of the kind of duties and responsibilities that a noble woman would have performed at that particular period in time in the 16th century. Once they were in the north, when they were in staying in Topcliffe or visiting the Northumberland estates, they were very much part of the northern nobility of England. They were a key couple in the kind of social scene, I suppose, as where in the north. In this period, they spent a great deal of time with the Earl of Shrewsbury. They were regularly invited to go hunting. They regularly had people back to their estates for hunting and for other activities as well. They were also kind of involved in kind of family networks, both Northumberland networks, largely kind of alongside Thomas Percy's younger brother Henry Percy, but also through Anne's own kind of family networks as well. Um, she was particularly close to her niece, Catherine Latimer, who then went on to marry her husband's brother, Henry Percy. And the couple then they become the Earl and Countess of Northumberland after our couple, Anne and Thomas, suffer their um, disappointments, I suppose, to put it mildly. So they were very much involved in the kind of northern nobility in England in this period in the kind of 1560s. What I think is quite interesting about Anne in particular is that she very, very rarely travelled to the royal court. It was quite common for noble women, noble wives, to travel on occasion at least with their husbands to the royal court, but Anne was very reluctant to do so. And in fact, there is a letter from Thomas Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, writing to William Cecil, where he says, if I have to come to court, if I have to come to London, can we make it about 3 months or so, because I cannot persuade my lady wife to come with me. So he didn't want to be there for any longer than a maximum of 3 months, because I'm sure he would have then, there would have been tension in the household, but he also admitted that he couldn't persuade Anne to travel to the court. And I find that quite intriguing in terms of what we're going to look at tonight, in terms of the rebellion that occurs in 1569, and then Anne's actions following the rebellion as well. I find it intriguing that she did not wish to attend Elizabeth's court, and that's something that kind of stood out to me when I first kind of came across these early sources about Anne. Let me just move this on. There we go. So yes, this evening we are going to think about Lady Anne Percy, and I'm going to hopefully cover some of the kind of key events that happen between the rebellion of 1569 and then her death in 1591, when she is a very prominent exile on the continent. But not kind of go over again the kind of details of it, but I find this quite an interesting diagram. It's from Fletcher's Tudor Rebellions. This is from the 4th edition, the 1997 edition. It may well be that there's a more recent edition, but I find this really helpful, this diagram, and it kind of has the key places and the different places that the rebels kind of travel to, and shows that there's different kind of not factions as such, but different groups that are involved in the rebellion beyond the Earl of Northumberland and Westmoreland. Just briefly, for the sake of this evening, the Northern Rebellion was a very short-lived affair. In many ways, it was quite ill-fated, I suppose, because it was not successful. And as mentioned, it actually leads to a great deal of really quite desperate repercussions meted out by the Elizabethan regime. But it lasted, it kind of kicked off in November 1569 and was really done with before Christmas in December of that year. To the rebellion being formally announced and formally breaking out, there had been a period in which Queen Elizabeth had demanded that Northumberland and Charles Neville, the Earl of Westmoreland, that they come to her, that they come to court in London and they attend on her, because she had heard rumours from various other figures, like the Earl of Sussex and various members of the Council of the North, that there was discontent amongst the northern nobility, and so they were instructed to attend upon Elizabeth. Northumberland did not go. At first he pled, he kind of said that he was too ill to attend. And Elizabeth accepted that excuse the first time around, and then a few weeks later she said, no, you must come and explain yourself. there had been further rumours of kind of stirrings against Elizabeth, and she'd also by this point heard that the Earl of Northumberland had been in communication with the Spanish ambassador, and had been in communication with Mary Queen of Scots, despite his denials that that had been going on. So she demanded once again, you have to come to court, and once again Northumberland refused to go, he refused to attend, and so the Earl of Sussex was sent to Topcliffe. And whilst at Topcliffe, he met with Lady Anne, and Lady Anne assured him that it had all been a big misunderstanding, that Northumberland had indeed been ill, and the reason he wasn't at Topcliffe now to meet Sussex was because he was out dealing with some kind of other estate business. And she kind of managed to persuade him that, you know, this had all been exaggerated and there was no problem, and that Northumberland was about to come to London immediately to attend the Queen. You can imagine then Sussex's surprise and fury that when he left Topcliffe, as he was leaving, the bells were rung to announce that the rising was beginning, and that it was to call Northumberland's tenants to attend. This had already happened at other places, but it had been kind of kept at this point at least, and had managed to convince them that it wasn't going to go any further. As he left, the bells were rung. And the rebellion was led principally by Northumberland and Westmoreland, but of course there were lots of other noble and gentrymen, and then people of all status involved, some who were of course forced to become part of the forces, and others who willingly joined. But they managed to raise quite a significant force. Eventually about 6,000 men had managed to come together, and they marched on Durham Cathedral, where they restored the Catholic Mass. And then they travelled to Hartlepool, where it was hoped that foreign aid would be arriving, principally from Spain, from those negotiations with the Spanish ambassador in the months prior to the rising. So Elizabeth wasn't quite, she was quite on the money in that regard, in the sense of hearing about what was going on beforehand. However, it quickly became apparent that no foreign aid was going to arrive in Hartlepool. And at the same time as recognising this, a significant force was being sent from the south, and was intended to meet the rebel earls and their men in the battlefield. Some said up to 10,000 men would be sent, and it was decided in the end that rather than staying to face that force, which would have been incredibly difficult to defeat considering the numbers and also the weaponry that the Queen's army would have had, they decided to actually flee. And they fled, at least many of the leaders and the kind of more senior people involved in the rebellion, including Northumberland, Westmoreland, and Anne. They fled into the Scottish borders in early December 1569. By Christmas Eve, December 1569, Thomas Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, had been captured and sent to the region of Scotland in Edinburgh, where he was held. Anne and Westmoreland had managed to secure shelter amongst somewhat sympathetic Scottish border lairds, including Alexander Lord Hume and Thomas Kerr, Laird of Ferniehurst. What's interesting is that these border lairds that sheltered Anne and Westmoreland had been men that Northumberland and Westmoreland had fought against in their roles as warden of the various marches and on the Council of the North. But there was very much a sense that there's a kind of accepted asylum, where, you know, political or religious refugees from England could seek shelter in Scotland and vice versa, and they wouldn't necessarily be returned on the demands of their government. And Elizabeth, of course, was not willing to go along with this. She demanded the return of all of the rebels, including Northumberland in particular. And the Regent of Scotland had a really difficult time trying to navigate whether he should return Northumberland to Elizabeth or continue to shelter them in Scotland. And in the end, Thomas Percy was returned to the English in June 1572. He was handed over, and then he was taken to York, where he was executed on the 22nd of August. Lady Anne and the Earl of Westmoreland, they managed to move from this kind of period of shelter in Scotland throughout 1570. August 1570, Lady Anne and then later Westmoreland, they managed to leave Scotland and travel to the Spanish Netherlands. And it is there that Anne spent the remainder of her life, amongst the exiled English Catholic community, in Mechlin, and then later in Louvain, and then in the end in Namur as well. The real intrigue, I think, in terms of Lady Anne Percy's role in the Northern Rebellion, is that she was personally, it really seems to be personally held responsible by contemporaries, but in particular by Elizabeth. Elizabeth seemed to have a real, genuine personal desire to see Anne punished. And we see this in the repercussions to the rebellion. So it's one of the bloodiest actual events of all the Tudor monarchs. Over 600 men were executed for their involvement. Of course, many of the nobles fled into exile, which was not necessarily an easy choice. It's, these men and women were still alive, but they are stepping away from, their financial support, their familial support. And whilst there are kind of continental networks that are there to support them, it's really starting from scratch again. So it's not an easy decision for these men and women to travel into exile. This on the screen is actually a pardon that's issued by Elizabeth to some of the people involved in the rebellion. What I find fascinating is that this pardon is issued after these 600 men or so have already been executed for their involvement. So it's a bit, it's very much something, it's a piece of propaganda. It's not necessarily something that is actually evidence of any kind of clemency. It talks about, Elizabeth's mercy, but by the time this pardon is issued, several hundred men have already lost their lives. So Elizabeth had a kind of personal agenda against Anne for Anne's involvement. I think that's a fair assessment. Henry Carey and Baron Hunsdon had described Anne as being the grey mare that is better than the horse, and this was part of a wider contemporary assessment that Anne was the driving force, that this wasn't just about, making gendered excuses about, men being overled by their wives. There was a genuine sense at the time that Anne was particularly motivated to rebel because of her devotion to her Catholic faith. And we'll come back to that just in a minute. But further evidence of Elizabeth's, kind of personal desire to see Anne punished. And we can see it in the Act of Attainder. So the Act of Attainder is issued against all the leaders. Anne is named third after her husband, and Westmoreland, it's Earl of Northumberland, Earl of Westmoreland, and then Lady Anne Percy, Countess of Northumberland. She is attainted separately, independently from her husband. She's one of the only women who's named in the attainder, and that's quite unusual. And I think it does reflect Elizabeth's kind of genuine ire against Anne. Part of the reason for this, I think part of the reason that Elizabeth was so determined to punish Anne is because Anne did not conform to the standard expectations of women involved in rebellion. There was a process, an expected process, whereby if your husband had been involved in rebellion or, had risen against their monarch or even a tenant against a lord, anything like that, a woman's role was expected. The kind of gender stereotype was that the woman would plead for mercy, not only for herself, but for her male relatives. And Anne did not do this. As a point of comparison, Jane Neville, the wife of the Earl of Westmoreland, she did. She did sue for clemency. She issued a petition, several petitions to William Cecil. She was granted an audience with Elizabeth where she was able to present her petition in person. And she threw herself on the mercy of the Queen. She employs lots of rhetorical strategies and rhetorical tropes, as expected in her petition, presents herself as very deferential, and very submissive. And she was successful. She actually did secure a personal pension from the Queen, and she was also allowed to keep hold of a small property that had been in her family. Anne did not do this. Anne refused to petition for clemency. And in fact, this is a copy of a letter. We don't have the original, sadly, from Anne, but this is a copy that was made of a letter that Anne sent to Henry Carey, Baron Hunsdon, after he had written to her. So he had written to her, and we know that because of the kind of internal contents of this letter, and this is her reply to him. And he'd obviously written to her, really encouraging her to throw herself on the mercy of Elizabeth. That he really did think there was still a chance that, she would be able to negotiate some kind of settlement for herself, perhaps not for Northumberland, but for herself at least. And in his reply, we see what I think is a real insight into her determination, her self-awareness, and her commitment to her faith and the actions that she has taken in the Northern Rebellion and will continue to take, as we'll see. She wrote, if I leave, by this she means if I leave England, and then also, if I leave to go to the continent more generally, but if I leave, it shall not be forgotten, and if I die, I trust God will reward you. So she's very aware of the stakes. She's not naive about what it is that she's risking. Praying your lordship earnestly once again that the pity and favour that you show unto me, that you will bestow it upon my poor children and servants to be a means to the Queen Majesty for them. Now, it's quite standard and common for women to ask for clemency for, servants and children, so she is kind of employing a rhetorical technique there. But she goes on to say, to make it clear that this is not just a kind of a trope that she's employing, that she is genuinely committed to what she has done and what she will continue to do, because she goes on in that same letter to say, "It was not for my offences that I fled, or fear of the Queen's mercy, for I never heard nor understood but her Majesty's mercy hath been as great as ever was any prince." Now, having studied Lady Anne Percy's letters for a really long time, both in my doctoral research and then producing the edition, I actually think that Lady Anne Percy is being a little bit, maybe not sarcastic, but she's not being entirely genuine when she's talking about the mercy of princes. I think she's being quite ironic there, in the sense that, it's very well known. It's very well known how merciful princes can be. And this letter, although on the letter here it says 1569, is actually from 1570 because of the change in date. This is after a lot of those men have been executed. So again, this sense of really how merciful can we expect our queen to be? But she goes on to say, "And cure led in my judgment, that is one of the special causes that upholds all estates." And I think this is a really remarkable letter. It's a letter that shows us that she is absolutely convinced that she has done the right thing, that she has no real regrets as such. She does have regrets. She also talks about being separated from her husband, which she says she'd never hoped to happen in all the world. She's not rejoicing in her circumstances, but she is very much still committed to the cause of the rising, and particularly rising in defence of her faith. So just to kind of briefly consider, folks, I think it's worth just taking a minute or two just to think then, if Lady Percy was so committed to this rebellion, and in fact, we know that she was personally involved in the events of the rebellion, when those bells had rung at Topcliffe before the Earl of Sussex had left for the court, Anne rode out with tenants from the estate. She gathered a small force of men independently, and she rode with them to meet up with her husband and the Earl of Westmoreland and the other supporters of the rebellion. When she was riding with her small force, she intercepted post, They disrupted the postal network between Scotland and England, where communications had been trying to get through between the region of Scotland and Elizabeth. And she also actually kind of held people captive and took people prisoner. And one of those prisoners actually described her as having the head and the stroke. Again, this kind of wider reflection of the sense that she's the one who's really keeping it going. And she was said to have encouraged the men to keep going after Durham, to really push on, and to be assured in their faith. So she's so committed to this rebellion, and then, the others involved, the men involved as well. We have to ask ourselves why? Why did they want to rebel? Why were they so committed to this cause, even though it seems to have been really kind of quick to start and then quick to finish? And traditionally, there's been kind of three main assessments. I think they all overlap, but I'll touch on them in turn. Um, Traditional historiography has tended to focus on the socio-political motivations of the men, so Northumberland and Westmoreland in particular. People like Fletcher kind of argued that this was very much an uprising that really grew from northern disaffection, northern discontent with the growing centralisation of the Elizabethan regime. And certainly true that Northumberland had been kind of overlooked for positions. He'd been removed from his position on the Council of the North, and southern men had been put in places in the wardenships and on the council, or men who were considered loyal to Elizabeth, who were perhaps not of the kind of ancient northern nobility, but were from kind of middling and gentry classes. And that's certainly the case. I absolutely would agree that that undoubtedly fueled this sense of alienation in the north amongst these noble families. Um, Northumberland personally had also found opportunities for mining on his lands, and they were claimed by the Queen, and then he was not able to kind of get the funds that he'd expected, so she kind of intervened to kind of, as he saw it, kind of prevent him from claiming his rightful due, his landed kind of rights. A ship as well had kind of crashed on the Northumberland coast a few years earlier that was carrying gold for Mary Queen of Scots from the King of Spain, and he had tried to kind of say this, again, my rights to this, and Mary Queen of Scots was unhappy with that, but also Elizabeth had intervened to again try and get the funds from that and redirected to the court. So there were undoubtedly kind of socio-political motivations that had led to a sense of discontent and alienation in the north. The other kind of key motivation, I suppose, that has been discussed among scholars in some detail is the role of Mary Queen of Scots, and whether the earls and the rebellion was intended to free Mary from her captivity. She'd arrived in England, of course, in May 1568, and she had kind of the potential, at least, was there for her to become a figurehead for movements for disaffected people who were unhappy with the Elizabethan regime. And from Northumberland, both Thomas and Anne, there was actually a connection to Mary, a real kind of direct connection to Mary in terms of kind of linking to what happened in the rebellion. When Mary had first arrived, in England in May 1568, Northumberland had gone to her and had tried to get her removed into his own personal custody. This had not been allowed, and he was absolutely furious because, again, he felt that he'd been snubbed there. We'll never know, of course, what his intentions were. Lady Anne Percy also visited Mary. She visited her at Bolton Castle, and Mary sent various gifts to the couple, including jewellery and French perfume for Anne. They communicated via letter and via messengers. There were attempts to kind of prevent them actually from communicating, as it became clear that they had been in touch with one another to such a degree. And there was actually a kind of scheme drawn up, which sounds a little bit incredible, so bear with me when I tell you of it, folks. But there was a scheme drawn up that Anne was going to visit the Queen at Wingfield, where she was being held by the Earl of Shrewsbury, and she was going to apparently be allowed access and then switch clothes with Mary so that Mary could escape and she would stay behind. Now, this sounds quite, unrealistic to us today. However, the Earl of Shrewsbury genuinely feared that it could have worked. When he wrote to report this plot, he admitted that Lady Anne Percy could have had access to his house because she'd travelled, she'd visited the Shrewsbury properties on several occasions. Remember when we were discussing this idea of them being part of this northern noble culture? She was familiar with his servants. She was familiar with some of Mary's servants, and there was a genuine fear that she could have actually got in. And if she had got in, he admitted that it may also have worked because Anne was said to be of similar stature and similar colouring to the Queen. So although there's no kind of contemporary portrait of Anne from her life, we can kind of imagine, I suppose, some degree of similarity with Mary. So there was a connection between Anne and Northumberland and Mary Queen of Scots. But Mr. J. Kesselring, who has done the kind of most in-depth assessment of the Northern Rebellion, although quite some time ago now, suggests that there isn't actually any direct evidence of Mary's involvement, and by that she means there's no evidence to suggest that Mary was actually encouraging the rebellion to start. No, she wasn't saying, yes, do this, I give my authority, I give my authorization for any actions. That doesn't mean she didn't know about it. And we know that she's in communication with the couple and she's in communication with various other people. And this rebellion of 1569 inevitably becomes tied up in the later Ridolfi plot that then leads to the Duke of Norfolk's execution as well in 1572. So there are, undercurrents that can still be teased out, but there is no direct evidence of Mary saying, yes, I would like you to do this, I instruct you to do this. She did offer financial support even after the rebellion, and Mary was constantly questioned about why she was supporting these people. And we do have correspondence after the rebellion as well, where she's offering kind of support in any way that she can for the exiles, in particular for Anne. And we know that the two women corresponded with one another using ciphered letters. So there is a connection to Mary, and Mary is very much involved. But in terms of whether she was the one directing it, there's very little evidence of that. Um, it's more to do with the kind of wider aims, and Mary was certainly seen as a potential figurehead, which is partly why she has her circumstances constrained over the years, because the English authorities fear that she will attract suspect, in their eyes, suspect attention. It's also the religious dimension, the aspect of faith, and the rebels' Catholic faith. And I think this has been underplayed by scholars, certainly in kind of, the last 30 years or so, although there's a change kind of more recently. The Catholic faith of Northumberland and Lady Anne Percy, and we'll look at Anne's faith in more detail to finish in a minute. But the Catholic faith as a motivating factor for this rebellion was the key aim of the rebels. The Earl of Northumberland and Westmoreland issued three proclamations over the course of November into early December, and in all of them, they set out that they had three aims. The first was to remove evil disposed councillors from Elizabeth's ear. This was quite a standard trope of any uprising where you are trying to position yourself as loyal to your monarch. It's the advice of those around them that you are trying to navigate and deal with. So they stated that. And they also stated that they wish to restore the ancient nobility of the North. And in their own declarations, they make it explicitly clear that they are trying to restore, preserve, maintain the Catholic faith in England, which has been stripped of its material culture, had been stripped of, any kind of religious freedom to attend mass or any of that. So they are absolutely explicit that their aim is to restore their faith. This meant that at the time it was quite easy because, of course, after this we start to see the persecution of Catholics in Elizabeth's regime extend and become more deteriorate further and further, the situation for Catholics in England. We've also seen that when they reached Durham Cathedral, they removed the English Bible and restored the Catholic Mass. And very much a key aspect of why I think their faith should not be overlooked is the fact that Northumberland had reaffirmed his faith in 1567. Before then, he had been considered quite a moderate. He was known to be conservative in religion, but he wasn't seen as anyone particularly of conviction. He was seen as quite moderate. And then in 1567, he declares that he's reaffirmed his faith, and he says that it's in part because of the reading of polemical texts like the works of Dr. Nicholas Sander, in particular the Supper of Our Lord in 1566. And this is Sander's 1571 De Visibili Monarchia, which sets out the suffering of English Catholics in the period. So Northumberland had presented himself and had become someone that, from the evidence that we have, had become more enmeshed in his faith. And I think it's too easy to just look at it from kind of 20th century and then modern day assessments of, well, no, it's all to do with the money and it's all to do with Mary Queen of Scots. They all tie into one another, and of course Mary as a figurehead for Catholics within England who felt that her cause was the more legitimate and that she had the legitimate claim to the English throne, far less the Scots throne, which she should be restored to. So these things all tie in. And I think that we actually do a disservice to both the rebellion of 1569 and understanding the rebellion and the people who lost their lives in that rebellion. But we do a disservice to Lady Anne Percy as well if we do not explore the significance of faith for the rebels. I said Northumberland had reaffirmed his faith in 1567 after reading a lot of the works of Nicholas Sander. And Anne was actually a close friend of Nicholas Sander. He and she correspond during her extensive exile, and she speaks about how he is her advisor, he's her spiritual advisor, but he's also offering her really practical advice in her exile as well. By kind of offering financial support and getting people to kind of help her. Had been more open about her faith, about her Catholic faith and her Catholic convictions. That was something that she was able to do in large part because of her gender. Marie Rowland and others have said, that have demonstrated how important women were to the preservation of the Catholic faith during the Elizabethan regime, partly because they were able to almost disguise themselves amongst this domestic arena where women were able to hide almost behind domestic expectations of women, where they would, maintain a household, they would pay the bills for feeding a household, they'd maintain diet books, all of that, and they were also responsible for the raising of children. But what this actually meant in effect was that you could present these things as just being part of your domestic agency and your domestic expectations. Actually, it gave women the chance to shelter priests and to raise children in the Catholic faith, even if the male head of the household was openly conforming or was at least, presenting themselves as someone who's openly conforming, who's attending church services. And Anne is very much part of that culture. We know that she sheltered priests at Topcliffe, one of them known as Dr. Lee. We don't know any more, but Dr. Lee travels with her when she rides out with the forces to join the rebellion in November 1569. She'd sheltered priests and she had raised their children, their 4 surviving daughters, in the Catholic faith. And quite poignantly, when she's in exile, she tries to make sure that this continues. And in a letter to her husband, Thomas Percy, a snippet of which you can see here, this is from the Cecil Papers, she writes about trying to have her daughters, and especially their eldest daughter, Elizabeth, brought over to the continent to be with her, not only to be physically reunited with her children, but to make sure that they are raised in the Catholic faith. And she writes to say, to pass them all together, I would not wish nor above two at once. This is for the practicalities of them not falling into the wrong hands. But whereof the eldest of all, Elizabeth, I wish the rarest because her age is fittest to receive instruction, and most ready to take knowledge now of the virtuous examples which here she should see and learn. And by that, Anne is referring to the exiled Catholic community in the Spanish Netherlands. And so we can really see this sense of her trying to maintain and raise her daughters in the faith. And actually, Elizabeth does remain committed to her faith. She marries into the Woodruffs of Yorkshire, who were an openly Catholic or an openly Reticent family, and she is open about her faith. Another daughter as well, Lucy, she marries into the Stanley family of Yorkshire, and again, these were families who were involved with they're aligned to Mary Queen of Scots and various plots to free Mary later, but they were also reticent families who maintained their faith openly when possible and secretly when not. So just to tie everything up, folks, before we finish this evening, I've tried to kind of give a sense of why I think it's important that we reconsider Lady Anne when it comes to the Northern Rebellion and also these Catholic experiences of the 16th century. I've tried to also kind of emphasize why I think we do need to include um, ideological affinities and religious convictions when we consider these events, and we do not just dismiss them as I think they have been kind of pushed under the carpet by historiography over the years, which has tended to focus, as I say, on the social culture. And so to finish, I think we can bring that all together by looking at Anne's experience of exile. Now, she spends 20 years, but it's really the 1570s that she is most prominent. She becomes one of the most prominent and influential English exiles on the continent up to about 1577. She is elected as the representative for the gentlemen fugitives who have come over after the rebellion of 1569. It's Anne who helps to secure them pensions. She secures a pension for herself, but she also is represented to get them a pension, which she does for many of them, from Philip II of Spain through the Duke of Alva in the Low Countries. So she's involved in the community there, but she's also involved in kind of wider Counter-Reformation schemes and plots. And this is a letter to Sir Thomas Stukely, who was instrumental in securing papal support for what was planned to be a landing in Ireland, to then raise the people of Ireland against England and then kind of come into England that way. It didn't quite succeed, but Nicholas Sander was involved in this kind of not invasion as such, but landing as well. So she's very much a part of transnational Catholic attempts to destabilise the English regime and various plots. And another way in which she does that is that she is kind of instrumental in publications of polemical texts on the continent. She is likely the person behind quite an obscure text, the Discours de Torbelle, which is about telling Northumberland's story and presenting him as a martyr, really, from persecution under Elizabeth. But we also know that she paid to have a new edition of the Treatise of Treasons published, with a dedication to Mary Queen of Scots as well. So she's involved in these various different ways of trying to continue to agitate and destabilise Elizabeth and Elizabeth's regime, whilst also maintaining her personal faith and becoming a person of significant influence in a wider faith-based community in the Spanish Netherlands in the 1570s. And I'm afraid that that's maybe a topic for another talk sometime in the future to look at in more detail at Anne's exile. But I think it's a nice way to kind of bring together the different aspects of Lady Anne's experience and the Northern Rebellion and the motivations behind that rebellion, which I hope I've managed to cover at least most of the key points this evening, folks. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, that was really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot this evening. I hope you have too. Do put your questions and comments in the box if you can. And Jade, I think, will hopefully answer those. So do you want to have a look at some of the questions or comments?
Let me just have a quick look. Well, thank you, folks. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. I hope it was illuminating this evening. As I say, it's very difficult to cover everything, and inevitably, because I get quite enthusiastic about Lady Anne Percy, as you can probably tell, I have to be really strict with myself. Otherwise, I would just, ramble on about all the great things I think that she does. And we don't have the space for that. So I hope at least the things we've managed to cover tonight have been illuminating. And yes, what led my interest in Lady Anne? So I remember actually coming to Lady Anne through the rebellion first, which is probably not unexpected. I had first become quite interested in the Northern Rebellion during my Lit at the University of Glasgow way back in 2012 now. And I became absolutely fascinated with the rebellion itself and was really kind of struck by the sense that I've kind of touched upon this evening about this idea of this is a rebellion that's very much framed by the people involved as being a rebellion that's certainly faith motivated. There are other things going on, as I've said, but it really struck me that that was something that was recognised at the time, and yet over kind of the historiography of the period has been downplayed. So I kind of came to Anne through the actual rebellion, and then my kind of second thing that struck me, which will not surprise any of you who've kind of looked at the types of thing I've worked on over the years, is I was furious that these women had been written out of the story. And Krista Kessering does a really good job to try and bring the women back into the story and try and recover as well some of the kind of ordinary women who lost, brothers, husbands, fathers, in that spree of executions after the event. But I think Lady Anne Percy and Jane Neville, the Countess of Northumberland, had similarly been downplayed, that their role had been overlooked. And so I was really trying to give them a chance to kind of, have the spotlight on them, I suppose, in a really basic way. And Jane Neville, the Countess of Westmoreland, is also a fascinating character. But as I kind of looked more into it and I started to come across Lady Anne Percy's letters, it was a real kind of lightning bulb moment for me, I suppose, because I'd started to work on um, Elizabethan Tudor letters, and then to come across a woman that I was really already getting quite interested in and find that she had letters, it all just kind of came together. And I was able to do my doctoral research on Anne and on those letters and kind of bring the letters together for the first time. Um, so that's how I kind of came to Lady Anne Percy, I suppose. The rebellion first, and then I've stuck with her. I've stuck with Anne. We have another question, I think. Let me just see. So, we have another question in the chat, folks. So I'll just read it so that you all kind of know what I'm responding to. So, hence the emphasis of traditional historiography on socio-economic causes of the rebellion rather than religious ones has it been due to confessional Protestant bias or just scholarly neglect? I think those two are probably actually kind of very much linked. If we think about, the kind of 20th century historiography of Elizabeth's regime, which has very much suffered at various points from confessional biases, I think that that is something that has kind of lasted. So yeah, I think that's probably something that is there. I think scholars have tried to move away from that, regardless of, the different approaches that they're taking. But I think that's something that certainly in the kind of older 20th century assessments of the rebellion was something that we could be conscious of. Yes, I think so. I think as well, there's a tendency, I think it's also been quite tied up with the kind of gendered historiography of the period, which, we've quite thankfully moved quite far past now, although we're not, we're still dealing with it. But I think it is kind of tied up with gendered assessments of it. I think until a lot of the great work was done on recovering women's agency and the preservation of the Catholic faith in Elizabeth's regime. I think before then, yeah, they kind of pushed against one another. They kind of came together, the overlooking of women and these confessional biases and kind of traditional historiography. They came together in this kind of perfect storm of neglect, I suppose, or bias. But after we had such great work, in the past 20, 30 years or so, looking at women's role in the preservation of faith, I think that has helped us to kind of step away from any kind of confessional biases. I think as well, there is a lot, and this is not the case now, there's some absolutely fantastic work on exile communities now, but similarly, when it comes to exile, for a long time there was a focus on the families and, individuals who were exiled under Mary the First, and looking at, evangelical or reformist women. And again, it's not until that same type of work was started to be done on the role of Catholic women that we can kind of start to move forward, I think, in a more valuable way. So yeah, I think it has been influenced by that in the past. Although thankfully, we've moved quite a bit past that now. And I think we have a question about our children. Let me check. Yep. So, looking at her children, I said that they did keep their faith, so Anne preserved that through to the next generation. And what are your thoughts on her influence on the experience of exile for Catholic women while she was alive, and then later through her daughter, Mary's role in the first English convents abroad? That is a really excellent question, and that is a question that I could actually sit and talk for another 45 minutes about. So I'm going to be really, really strict and not get down the rabbit hole. You'll have to have me back, and we can talk about Anne's exile and the kind of significance of her influence and her actions. But very briefly, I think that she is really a kind of critical figure in the 1570s, both for other Catholic women who are exiled, who have either chosen to some degree voluntarily, and I say that with, air quotations because these people are pushed to make this decision, but have chosen to exile themselves or are forced for various reasons to do so. She is recognised within the communities in the Spanish Low Countries as being someone of influence, the fact that she's elected as their representative, but she's also in communication, she's also in, personal contact, day-to-day contact with some of the other wives who come over into the exile communities as well. So I think she actually does have quite a significant role in terms of influencing other Catholic exiles, other Catholic women. One of the ways she does that is she very cleverly, and this is what we see in her letters in particular, is she very cleverly adopts the persona of the widow of a Catholic martyr. And that is something that she uses to great effect. Having her husband be killed is obviously not a positive thing in any way or form, but it allows her a degree of freedom that, women whose women who are out there as exiles with their husband or with their brothers or with their father, that they don't quite have the same level of freedom, because Anne is a widow and she has the status of being the widow of a man who's died for his faith and has died because of the persecution of the Elizabethan regime. That is really critical to her gaining influence in the 1570s. And that's something I think that's recognised when people write back, so when it's reported back that she's died in Namur in 1591, there are various letters to her daughters to say, she's died. And she's left this small amount of money that she's built up over her pension and some jewels and things like that. And Mary Percy manages to get her hands on that money, and that money then is kind of invested in the English convent. So there's kind of links across the generations, absolutely. But I'll stop myself because otherwise we'll be here all night, folks. I'll just be going on and on about all the great things that she does in exile. Well, thank you. It was an excellent question, Michelle. Thank you.
It's really interesting. As I say, I found it very fascinating, Jade. So I think it's great that you're sort of emphasising the role of women during this time, Catholic women, because it's so important. It's one of the things I feel very strongly about. I've written articles and done talks on Catholic women, strong Catholic women during the Elizabethan and subsequently as well. And I think it's great. And historiography has changed a lot in the last few years, and the narrative has changed considerably during, of what people were doing during the reign of Elizabeth I. There's far more critical analysis now than there ever was before. Sometimes there was the old party line typical of that era, but now we're getting a lot more interesting research, and yours has added to that, and it's absolutely fascinating. I think gender is such an important issue during this reign, and as you said, women were able to kind of hide behind the sort of, oh, I'm only a wife type of thing, whilst doing other things at the same time. And it was a very cunning plan. And it was used extensively by recusant women throughout England during the reign of Elizabeth I and James I as well. So, that's a very, very interesting point there. And I think the role of women in exile, English Catholic women in exile on the continent is there's a lot more. I mean, you'd be very welcome to come back and do a talk on that sort of thing. Of course, you've got the convents, you've got the widows, and all sorts of women who are doing all sorts of incredible things in the Low Countries and France and so on.
Yep.
And there's a whole area of research. There's a whole, there's a book in there as well, I'm sure, another book perhaps. But it's been really interesting. I don't know if anybody's got any more questions before we finish. I found it interesting, the link between Mary Queen of Scots and Lady Anne Percy as well. And there seemed to be great sympathies between them, but two strong women, one Scottish, one English, but two strong women. And I think that's absolutely crucial, that we understand the role of these strong women, and they weren't sort of weak and second rate in any way. They were actually very powerful, very intelligent, very brave women. And that's a great thing that's coming out in history, and I think it's so important now to actually emphasise that. And we've had talks on many women in the English Catholic History Association over the last year or two, and hopefully we will in the future as well.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And yeah, I absolutely agree that women in exile and women in the convents who are able to direct so much agency whilst being in the convents, but also these lay women who have different experiences again, but who are doing all kind of working within this experience of being in exile, and that's the kind of key thing, I think. So yeah, absolutely, we could talk about that another time, I'm sure.
Yeah. It must have been very annoying for Elizabeth I that these women, that she couldn't shut them up, so to speak.
Yes.
Couldn't stop them doing things abroad. Although I know they had spies and all sorts of things on the continent, and sometimes assassination of various people. But Elizabeth was pretty much powerless, and that's the interesting thing, really, that it was beyond her realm and beyond her power. And it's a female monarch against these Catholic females, sort of thing. It's kind of an interesting clash there, really. Yeah. But faith is a big issue, power is a big issue. There's lots of other issues too.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's a really kind of interesting point that you raised there as well, because I think with Lady Anne Percy, we really see that in action, this idea of Elizabeth kind of inability to get what she wants from these people. And at one point, Lady Anne Percy and Sir Francis Englefield, amongst others, are moved on when there is a brief, very, very brief negotiation for a kind of truce between the factions in the Low Countries. And they move on and they go to Liège and they're sheltered by the Bishop of Liège there. And Elizabeth writes to the Bishop of Liège saying, "You need to get rid of her. I want her kicked out. She should not be sheltered by you." And he writes back to say, "I can't. I'm really sorry. She has the backing of the Pope, and she's just a refugee," and playing all these different kind of um, rhetorical strategies to explain it, but essentially goes no. And Lady Anne Percy and Englefield are the only ones who are allowed to remain in Liège at that point. So I think that's really, a really remarkable thing that happens.
Mm. That must have really riled the Elizabethan authorities, I would imagine, really. Somebody
Yes.
defying them.
Yes.
But quite rightly so, sheltering refugees and so on. There's a history of that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your talk this evening. It's been absolutely amazing. I knew you were going to be good, and it certainly is extremely good.
Thank you.
So thank you, and do come do another talk for us again. That would be absolutely amazing if you could.
Yes,
And
yes, definitely.
as we all know, there's more speakers in the future. We've got speakers lined up for the whole of this year. So we're looking for speakers for next year now. And if you know anybody knows anybody or can recommend somebody to do that, that would be great. And and just to remind us that we have the Timeline project on our website. We're always looking for more articles as well. Do have a look at it if you haven't already looked at it. We're always looking for more people to write articles on various aspects of English Catholic history from the Roman period to the present time, pretty much. So do have a look at that, and say if you know anybody who wants to write an article or whatever, then that would be absolutely great. I'm sure there's some people listening to this talk this evening who think, I know somebody who will be likely to do that. Okay, so just let us know. And this recording will be on the YouTube channel within a matter of days, as usual. So if you didn't manage to listen to it all, or you know somebody who wasn't here, let them know, and they'll be able to watch it. So thank you very much, Jade. That was brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me,
Bye.
folks. Thanks.
A pleasure. A great pleasure. A great pleasure. Bye-bye,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.